Hear me, demigods, my children beloved, make of thyselves that which ye desire. Be it a lord, be it a god, but should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken, amounting only to sacrifices.
The lore of the lands between have been explored extensively at this point, quite thoroughly. I mean, the game has been out for 2 years at this point, but still there are many questions that can still be pondered upon, especially consider the vastness of the lore within Elden Ring and the lands between. Be it in-lore politics, geography, warfare, and even time can be discussed when considering the lore of Elden Ring. And yes, time. Ooh, that one is annoying to deal with. But of course, the most interesting part of it are the wars. Yes, you played Elden Ring in order to fight, let's be honest. This is a war fantasy game. And being a war fantasy game written by George R.R. Martin, he really did a stellar job along with Miyazaki at creating incredibly interesting and conflictual moments in the history of the lands between. The peoples of the lands between are no stranger to conflicts. In fact, the conflicts that they are used to would make our own history conflicts look like a joke in comparison. I mean, this is a fantasy setting, so that's the point after all. Champions of mythological status, magic of legendary might, and actual demigods roaming the battlefield make for the theater of war in the lands between a true marvelous spectacle to behold, and a miserable experience if you happen to find yourself in the crossfire. But even the might of the demigods cannot evade some cruel, paid monotonous realities of warfare. Food, water, equipment, and supply maintenance. The overall logistics of war was still a puzzle that the demigods had to deal with, especially considering this nightmarish map that they call home. Geography can be just as much as a big adversary as any enemy knight. Traversing through certain terrain can also be one hell of a pain, and I mean, just look at this monstrosity of a map. You play the game, you walk through it, and you know how nightmarish it can be. Which brings us to the question posed in this video, one that I've been asking myself for quite a long time. One that is intrinsically tied to one of the most important conflicts in the lands between within its greatest war, the Shattering. How did Malenia march from the Halig Tree to Caelid? And oh boy, that's quite a difficult question to answer. I mean, there are so many ifs and hows and whys. I mean, how did they even reach south is one of the questions. How did they deal with the challenge of logistics due to this atrocity of a map? And how could that legendary undefeated campaign that Malenia orchestrated could have helped her and Miquella reach their goals? It's something quite interesting to ponder, and still something that I quite don't get the answer for, but at least we will try our best to figure this out on this video, hopefully. So get yourselves comfortable and welcome to the war theater of the lands between. As I was researching this topic, and by research I mean finding excuses to play this game even more, I suddenly came across another just as important question and just as difficult problem to deal with when it comes to actually formulating this video. And the problem was time. Yes, time. Sounds kinda boring, doesn't it? But bear with me. Here's the thing. There is no metric system to accommodate the passage of time in the lands between. At least none that we at least know of, none that we as the player has been aware of. And that makes piecing together the history and events of the lands between in a chronological order quite an obnoxious ordeal. It's quite annoying to not know when certain things happen and if they happen before certain things or after another thing, you know. It can be quite confusing to piece everything together. Which is made even more annoying considering that this is by design. Yes, this is the writer's design of From Software in order to keep the story as interpretative as possible. I mean, it is the charm of the lore of the lands between, of all the Souls-like games, but sometimes it can be quite annoying when you're a lore enthusiast. So I tried my best to at least build a timeline in order to make more sense for the context of why Malenia started her march south. And keep in mind that the timeline of events that I will present here is speculative at best, for it's quite impossible to ascertain with precision what, how, and when every detail of it happens, or when it exactly happened in the lands between. So let's start with the beginning, the shattering. And the current context is as followed. The Elden Ring is shattered, Marika is in prison within the base of the Erdtree, and that immediately creates a power vacuum in the capital of Leyndell. Within the city, that power vacuum is eventually filled, albeit shortly, by two figures that are competing for the power within the city, political power. Godric, a very distant descendant of the golden lineage of Godfrey, and he's being contested by the then quietly unknown veiled monarch, Morgoth. As you would expect from two opposing sides fighting a conflict in order to grab a power vacuum, an internal political and possibly even martial dispute could have ensued within the city, and whatever was the case, the result was Godric being beaten and humiliated, which prompted him to hide among the women and children in order to escape the persecution of the capital and its new ruler. This effectively hounded Godric from the city and cemented Morgoth's place as the effective regent of the city. And at this point, it's quite safe to say that the other demigods eventually caught wind of this. I mean, they probably had spies in the city, or they had some sort of informants. It's hard to believe that someone like Miquella or Rykard would simply stand by without knowing anything that's happening. So they probably already caught wind of this. Their decisions in what to do vary quite drastically, though. Some sought not to fight immediately, preferring to fortify their positions. Some sought neutrality from the conflict altogether, preferring to not play any sides and just stay within their realms. Rhea Lucaria, for example, the school remained firmly neutral throughout the whole conflict. And some prepared for immediate combat, considering that the situation was ripe for the taking. And for the mighty General Radhan, specifically, he chose the latter. Likely, he assumed that Leyndell was just easy picking at this point, which was a assumption that would have been very easy to make considering the conflict that the city has just been through, when considering the power vacuum left by Marika in her internment within the Erdtree. The city was probably a disorganized mess, internally and probably even outside of it, and its current ruler was an unknown individual called the Veiled Monarch, and the only other demigod that was present at the city was effectively hounded from it, and was just licking his wounds in an attempt to recompose from the humiliation. The opportunity to take the city was presented itself by Radhan, at least that's what he was likely to believe. And also, keep in mind, this theory comes from this image. If you wish to subscribe to the idea that this is not Radhan, then well, eventually this timeline just crumbles. But for the sake of this video, let's just take that this is Radhan, and that's it, okay? Again, with the opportunity presenting itself to Radhan, he marched north with his mighty host, adamant and confident that his soldiers' might, discipline, and experience would eventually take the capital in a great siege. After all, who was there to contend with him? The only other ruler, as mentioned, that now controls the city was an unknown at the time veiled monarch. Who was he to challenge the great General Radhan? We could look at Radhan's decision in this respect and believe that it was rushed and probably foolish to simply walk through the capital, march with his forces, believing that he would simply take it due to some internal strife, especially when you consider the amazing defenses that the city has. Two greater outer walls that would have been nearly impregnable to any sort of assault. But keep in mind certain context that Radhan was presented to himself. Godric was hounded from the capital, fleeing like a coward. The Carians and Rhea Lucaria Academy probably already announced their neutrality at the shattering at this point. Rykard was his brother and probably would not get in Radhan's way. Probably wouldn't. Miquella and Malenia did not seem to have any interest in the conflict at this point whatsoever as well, and they seemed to be more preoccupied at planting some trees. So as far as anyone knows, as far as Radhan knows, the capital was probably in shambles, disorganized as mentioned before, and the soldiers that fought for the city were probably very confused by all of it. So Radhan saw the chance to actually go ahead of the war. Imagine if he was successful, considering everything that I just said. Radhan would have been the ruler of the city. He would have more than one great rune. The Elden Ring and the Erdtree would have been at the palm of his hand, and he would have an incredibly good logistical and geographical position, strategical position that he could fortify his forces. The capital is insanely hard to take, and if you get the opportunity to actually take such a hard and well-defended city, then you're basically set for the shattering. Imagine Radhan as the ruler of the Earth Tree. That place would have been impregnable. I mean, it's already nearly impregnable. It was only breached twice, as if my memory does not escape me. Never mind, it was actually breached only once by the dragons. So yeah, the opportunity presented itself to Radhan, and probably he took the best opportunity he would ever have at this point in the war. Keep in mind, this is a war of demigods. The opponents that they face are incredibly powerful, so this was the best opportunity he probably ever had, and it just presented itself to him in a golden platter. So one can only imagine his surprise in finding not a confused, unmotivated force defending a very disorganized city, but a very well-organized, powerful, and motivated army ready to defend their homeland, and led by a demigod of all people. And also, the irony that Radhan was actually beaten back by a son of Godfrey himself probably escaped his notice. One of the great ironies in the history of the lands between. He was beaten by the son of the men he adored and idolized. Although beaten but not killed, Radhan eventually retreated back to Caelid in order to replenish his forces and lick his wounds. After the forces of Caelid were repelled from the Altus Plateau, successfully repelled at that, the city was probably given some reprieve from further conflict. At least that's what we assume in this timeline at the very least. Although in time another massive siege would eventually plague the capital, this time caused by an arguably far less powerful opponent, but one that was arguably as well far better prepared to deal with the city's defenses. Godric, being Godric, 100% grew resentful at his political loss to the Veil Monarch and subsequently sought to pay back through military means. The conflict we witness in the cinematic trailer for Elden Ring is that conflict. Like his previous attempt to take the city, this one also met with failure. Even though Godric's forces apparently succeeded in breaching the outer walls, or at least going through its gates, which is impressive to say the least, they were still massacred before they could breach the inner walls. Even their initial success didn't amount to much, and they were bound to fail. Morgoth was simply too crafty of a commander. He managed to defeat a far more powerful rival than Godric could ever hope of being in Radhan, and he has the means, the resources, and the infrastructure to actually defend a really powerful and important city. And he also had the zeal of both himself and the soldiers that was following him. He simply had it all to win. And with this context, we finally now reach the point in the history of the lands between where Malenia legendary campaign south actually started being conceived. To her, this context could have been better for her and her brother, when I mean her. Two major players in the Shattering were defeated and beaten back by the Veiled Monarch. Karya and its noble family were deposed from the Academy of Rea Lucaria, and Rykard was doing nothing of any notice at this point of the war. The stage was simply set for Malenia to actually march south. And now this is the point of the video where I should present myself, or I should present the answer that I formulated on how and why did Malenia actually march south. Why did her and her brother believe that this was a good idea, militarily speaking? Was there any strategical reason for her to do this? And my answer is that I have no idea. Thanks, George. It's impossible to actually know why Malenia and Miquella actually decided to go south, but there are reasons as to why they would. Not reasons, more like speculations as to why they would march south, why they would start such a massive campaign of carnage. So here's some of the speculations that I managed to cook for this video, and trust me, they're just speculations. Some of them come from other YouTube lore channels that actually made a really good job on the topic, but the truth is we don't actually know why Malenia actually went south. This was purposely left out from the narrative in order for us to fill up the spaces. I mean, this is a Souls game. This is a very interpretive work, and it was written by these two maniacs. So yeah, good luck actually figuring anything out in this that is actually conclusive. But I digress. And there are three prevalent theories as to why Malenia actually marched off south. The first is due to some convoluted scheme set by Miquella in an attempt to save Godwyn from destined death. Apparently the three demigods, Godwyn, Malenia, and Miquella, were very close. At least some lore enthusiast likes to believe that, and there are some suggestions that that was actually the case. so in an attempt to actually save him from destined death, there was some reason as to why they would march south. The second reason for Malenia to actually march south was in search of her missing brother. In this speculation, in theory, Miquella, would have already been kidnapped by Mohg, and that would have triggered a reason for Malenia to actually march with her forces south. I particularly do not subscribe to the theory because, in all honesty, I find it very difficult that one of the most important, if not the most important person within the Caelid tree would be so easily kidnapped while his most powerful enforcer was also present at the Caelid tree. I sincerely do not believe that Mohg would have been capable of actually, kidnapping Miquella while Malenia and her Cleanrot Knights were still there in order to defend him. The place is very well guarded, even as of now. Can you imagine at its prime? It's difficult to see Miquella actually being taken that easily. Now for the third and far more pragmatical reason as to why they probably went down south would be an attempt for a power grab. By conquering both Stormveil Castle and Caelid, she would have effectively defeated two of her greatest rivals in the Shattering, opening her way for a greater siege at the capital. If she was able to encircle the city, geographically speaking, there would be no opposition for her to actually worry about being attacked from the rear. That would allow her more time and more resources in order to actually keep pounding the city in a battle of attrition. And for the sake of this video, let's subscribe to the idea that Miquella actually sent Malenia down her path south, because, like I said before, I still doubt very much that Mohg would have been successful in kidnapping him while Malenia was still around to actually say something about it. And now it comes the point of the video where we actually discuss the battles that were actually fought for Malenia and her campaign, her undefeated campaign south, and let's start with Stormveil. The first battle of Malenia's campaign was the Battle of Stormveil, which was more of a humiliating massacre rather than a fight if I were to speculate. Apparently being humiliated by Morgoth was not enough for Godric. By the way, he was humiliated twice by the guy, and this time he decided to throw jabs at Malenia herself. Yes, Godric for some reason looked at Malenia and thought it was a good idea to actually taunt the mightiest sword wielder in the lands between. For some reason he looked at her and her Cleanrot Knights and thought, nah, I will win. Even prior to the Shattering, there were very few military forces in the land between that actually had the strength, competence, or the stomach to actually fight the Cleanrot Knights. And trust me when I say this, Godric had none of it. He was a very incompetent ruler. His forces were probably very fatigued from the siege that they have just failed. We do not know the amount of time they had in order to prepare for Malenia's downward march. Needless to say, Godric eventually was defeated by Malenia. Humiliatingly so by some in-lore sources. And we also have no way of knowing the amount of reprieve that Godric's forces actually had in order to prepare for another siege, one that they actually would have to defend themselves from, and one that they had to defend against the Cleanrot Knights, which were, again, a very difficult force for you to deal with, especially considering their abilities and nuances. The the Scarlet Rot was a very difficult ailment to deal with in the lands between for both us, the player. You can only imagine how much worse it would have been in a siege where disease could have run rampant if not properly, addressed. Although it is surprising to note that Malenia chose to actually not kill Godric when she claimed his castle. Neither did she claim his Grey Rune at that matter, which is actually quite interesting for you to ponder on. The reasons as to why she did such a thing can only be speculated, but if I were to make a political guess, I would say that keeping Godric alive as a political anchor or puppet for management of Stormveil could have been a very viable reason to keep him alive. Stormveil would have been a very strategically and logistically important asset for Malenia and our armies, and keeping Godric alive as a puppet or as a hostage would have prevented some discontent among the Stormveil Castle soldiers, even ensuring their loyalty in possible future battles. Another reason as to why you should keep Godric as a hostage. Allowing Godric to also keep his Grey Rune at the time could have also had some strategic importance as well, since carrying 2 Grey Runes would paint a very big target on your back, and the potential of actually losing 2 Grey Runes in one catastrophic blow was simply not an idea that I would envision Malenia envisioning.
Hey, that really sucked!
Which is especially true when you consider who her next opponent was going to be. So after crushingly defeating the stormveil forces and their leader, Malenia and the Clergyman Knights set their sights east, where they would encounter a far more prepared, disciplined, and powerful force, led by, again, a far more powerful and competent commander than Godric could ever hope to be. The mightiest of the demigods himself, the conqueror of the stars, awaited the Severed One to fight in the fields of Caelid. The second and last battle of Malenia's campaign, which was the Battle of Caelid, it's actually quite difficult to figure out how long that conflict actually lasted, but we can easily assume that it was one of the fiercest of the Shattering, if not the fiercest, even though the most appalling one can go for another conflict that we may discuss or may not in another video. But keep in mind that the armies fighting in Caelid during Malenia's march were the two most powerful and perhaps the most skilled ones throughout the entirety of the Shattering. The battle was bound to be vicious and hardly fought. They also boasted by being commanded by the two singularly most powerful demigods of the whole war, probably the most singularly powerful beings after Malenia being interred within the Golden Throne. The Golden Throne? Wait, what? Within the Earth Tree. Oh, also, keep in mind that Malekith himself was not around. I know, it's kind of weird to actually sprinkle him into this story out of nowhere, but he is the most feared individual throughout the Lands Between, and the only one that could realistically kill every single other demigod if he just decided to go John Wick about it. So the fact that he simply disappeared or was doing nothing, even if anyone know what he was doing, 100% helped the aggression within the Lands Between and the whole of the Shattering. Going back to the Battle of Caelid, what we do know with certainty is that Malenia and Radhan eventually had their one-on-one duel. One of such mythological scale that it not only devastated the land of Caelid itself, but also effectively stagnated any major hostilities of the Shattering. With Radhan rotting away and Malenia being literally dragged away from Caelid by one of her own soldiers, no less, there was no other major force left to realistically fight in the Shattering. The Shattering was effectively over after the Battle of Caelid, and the stagnant status quo that we witness throughout our playthrough as a player in the game actually began afterwards. In the end, the campaign, this military campaign orchestrated by both Miquella and Malenia, actually didn't achieve anything outside of stagnating the war into a halt, and the reasonings for doing so are still shrouded in speculation to this day. It's hard to see any strategical gain, if any, there were to be afterwards when looking in retrospect to everything that they did during the Shattering. It was an incredible display of martial prowess, but outside of that, the war that was orchestrated by the two twins didn't achieve much outside of what I already mentioned, stagnating the war. But leaving the whys to aside, let's go into the hows, which is again another incredibly big can of worms to open. Oh god, and here I thought that this was going to be the easier part. So yeah, I looked back at the map of the Lands Between, which was the reason as to why I decided to actually give my shot at this video, putting my geographical knowledge and my degree in foreign affairs into this video. So analyzing this geographically, I came to the conclusion that this map is a nightmare. Throughout me looking at this map, I constantly asked myself, how did she actually manage to logistically move an entire army and orchestrate an entire military campaign from the Caelid tree all the way to Caelid? How did she actually physically moved all that way? That was a question that I actually asked myself, which allowed me to waste a lot more time than I'm actually proud to admit. But still, going back to the question, how did she actually do it? Well, it's difficult to walk through the Lands Between alone as a player. So imagine actually having to deal with an entire army at your back. Sure, you would have enjoyed the best security one could ask, but marching an army would bring its fair share of logistical problems. Availability of water, food, equipment, sheltering, a constant line of resources to fall back to. All of these are problems that you need to address in order to solve the problem of warfare. And how in the actual fuck did she actually find a solution to this bullshit is, to be fair, beyond me. Granted, I will give it that it's very likely that the overall infrastructure and geography of the Lands Between suffer some gargantuan changes from the time Malenia actually fought Radhan to when we as the player actually arrive in it. So with all that said, I will work with the map that we are given as a player and somehow deduce how Malenia actually went from the Caelid tree all the way down to Caelid. And let's try to be quick about this. This video is probably long enough as it is. First, and my favorite most likely method, they used ships. Yes, ships. Using ships would allow for Malenia's forces to circumvent a lot of the geographical and logistical problems she would have faced eventually in the lands between. Loading her troops into ships and disembarking them where they would face no initial hostility is a sound strategy, outside of the fact that ships can be a really good supply line. But here's a problem. Where you disembark? There are no shipping lanes that we know of in the lands between. And the only beach where it would be strategically sound for her to disembark her troops is south of stormveil, which is going to be a problem in by itself later on, just bear with me. And looking back to the sources that I actually used in order to formulate this video and its ideas, I looked back to one of the sword monuments that you find north of Stormveil, and here's why I said it would be quite contradictory as to why her troops would disembark south of Stormveil. Because it states, here marks Malenia's southward march, which means she must have been here at some point and then march by foot south in order to engage Stormveil. And that's weird, because where did she disembark with her ships? I mean, it's the most likely reason, as most likely how, as she actually did in order to traverse the lands between. I mean, the Caelid tree does not make physical contact with the mainland, so it would make a lot of sense for her to have ships in order to even reach it. Yes, we don't reach it through a ship, we are spirited away from it, towards it. But still, there must be a more practical way to move large quantities of soldiers, supplies, and anything else. So this is my favorite method as to how she actually did it, but still there are some problems within it that I did not manage to circumvent or explain. But still, I'm gonna subscribe to this one. There's 2 more to go, so get ready. The second method is that she simply marched by foot from the Caelid tree all the way down to Caelid. In this method, you probably utilize the grand lifts in order to traverse the lands, but this one is very highly unlikely. And the reason why that's unlikely is the position and to where the lifts actually leads to, specifically the grand lift road. It leads directly inside of Leyndell. And you can trust me that Morgoth, one of the most paranoidly fanatical of the demigods, would simply never have allowed the Cleanrot Knights to walk inside the city of Leyndell. And since there's also no evidence that they actually did, this method's also very likely never occurred. And keep in mind, this is important because the Cleanrot Knights and the rotting nature of their fighting style would have been very dangerous in a siege. In a normal siege, if an enemy soldier actually enters your castle and if he breaches your walls, the fight is over. You lost. You effectively lost. It's very difficult to control the chaos that's about to ensue inside of the city. Now imagine an opponent that actually rots the flesh around him, of those around him. Can you imagine the amount of disease that would actually spread throughout if they do not actually enforce some restraint upon themselves, the clean rots, I mean? So yeah, Morgoth would simply never have allowed Malenia, of all people, to simply walk through the capital, because that would be effectively game over. So again, her march south would have not been likely. It is physically possible. There is a straight road towards Stormveil. You can even see it in the map. I mean, I'm looking right here. I'm showing to you right here. You can actually walk, assuming, of course, that the roads were not destroyed, the bridges were also actually not destroyed, which was the case for us as the player. But you can do it. You can physically do it. You can walk from the north, the far north, and actually walk straight down towards Stormveil. It is possible, but very unlikely considering the players that are involved in this war theater. The third and honestly the most monotonous theory is that they simply somehow teleported, which for me is boring as fuck, but hey, give me a break. Maybe Malenia could have actually, not Malenia, but maybe Miquella could have actually pulled something like that off. Some Avacadabra bullshit. I mean, there is teleporting technology in the lands between. None that teleports entire armies per se, or at least none that I know of, but then again, we are talking about Miquella. His guy is the analogy for Fento, or more commonly known as Griffith, that bitch in the Elden Ring verse. So yeah, maybe he could have pulled something like that off. He was said to be the most fearsome of the Empyreans and likely the most resourceful of them. So yeah, this is still a possibility. It's quite boring of a conclusion in order to say, yeah, they just teleported my armies and then I started from Stormveil towards and then I went to Caelid. That would be kind of a boring thing to do. But then again, I'm talking about logistics in warfare. This is boring by default. So yeah, a wild guess, but again, perhaps Miquella, the allegory to Griffith in this game, could have possibly done it. In the end, we can only hope for more answers in future DLCs, assuming the next one is actually nearby. But it's still very impressive to me how this game can be so extensive in its lore, so engaging that even after 2 years of its release, you can still talk about and debate such topics in such an entertaining way. The lore of the lands between and its narrative was so intrinsically written, although there are some obnoxious parts of it that makes me go mad and any other lore enthusiast to go mad, but still this game was a masterpiece when it comes to world building, and studying the lands between a more militaristic and logistical lens will always be fun and entertaining for me, and hopefully it was also entertaining for all of you. This has been a Discount Russian. I hope you like this kind of content. I intend to make more lore videos, assuming that this one actually does well. I also hope you have enjoyed. I wish you the best. Considering liking and subscribing to this video, and also comment down below if you believe I got something wrong, if I made a mistake lore-wise. This is a very big lore. It's enormous, the amount of information that there is in Elden Ring, so you're eventually bound to get something wrong, especially considering that there are very few conclusive evidence, or at least conclusive conclusions to these evidence in order to speculate upon. So again, I wish you all the best, considering subscribing, liking, and commenting on this video, and I'm out. All the best. Peace.